Let's face it, not every Pokémon game is a masterpiece. For a franchise that practically prints money, Pokémon has had some embarrassingly bad releases, games that critics torched, titles that fans pretended never existed. And yes, plenty of bizarre spin-offs, gimmicky puzzles, and rushed cash grabs that barely passed as real games. This list doesn't pull punches. These are the Pokémon games that earned the worst critical reception in the franchise's entire history. Judged by the one metric no developer can escape, Metacritic. Some of these games were broken at launch. Others were lazy rehashes. A few had good ideas buried beneath awful execution. And yet, many of them still have defenders, players clinging to nostalgia or convinced that critics just didn't get it. So today, we're diving deep into Metacritic's Pokémon Hall of Shame. From awkward racers to forgotten free-to-plays, from soulless sequels to half-baked experiments, these are the 30 worst-rated Pokémon games ever released. And the brutal reasons why they failed. Prepare yourself. Because your childhood favorite? It might just be on this list. This is the 30 worst Pokémon games according to Metacritic. First up on our descent into disaster is a game that dared to be different, Pokémon Ranger. A spin-off that introduced a bold new capture mechanic, an action-oriented story, and even managed to spawn 2 sequels. On paper, a fresh, exciting way to experience the Pokémon world. In practice, a repetitive mess that wore out both your patience and your stylus. The core loop of frantically drawing circles to catch Pokémon was praised for its creativity at first. But as battles grew more complex and the circle spamming got more tedious, frustration began to outweigh fun. Critics called the mechanics shallow, the pacing sluggish, and the novelty short-lived. Even fans who enjoyed the world and story admit that Ranger feels more like a minigame stretched to full length than a full-fledged Pokémon experience. It might not be the worst on this list, but its Metacritic score of 69 marked the beginning of a sub-series that never quite found its footing. And believe it or not, things only get worse from here. Tied with Ranger, and arguably just as divisive, is the Switch remake of Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, Rescue Team DX, a game that had everything going for it, on paper. A beloved classic remade with a gorgeous new watercolor art style, quality of life improvements, and modern hardware power behind it. Sounds like a dream come true, right? But critics weren't sold. Behind the fresh coat of paint was a slow, grind-heavy experience that felt trapped in its Game Boy Advance-era design. The dungeon crawling was repetitive. The story, while charming, couldn't make up for the sluggish pacing. And while longtime fans appreciated the nostalgia, newcomers were left wondering what all the fuss was about. For many critics, it felt like an old skeleton dressed in beautiful cosplay, a remake that looked modern but refused to evolve its gameplay in meaningful ways. It's a harsh reality. You can polish a relic, but if the core game design hasn't aged well, critics will notice. That's why Rescue Team DX lands at a mediocre 69 on Metacritic, a remake that reminded some players why the original was better left a memory. And we're only 2 games in. From a remake trapped in the past to a global phenomenon that launched broken. Next up is Pokémon Go. Yes, the Pokémon Go, the app that turned the entire planet into one big Pokéstop. The cultural lightning strike of 2016, the game that had people sprinting through traffic for a Vaporeon. But here's the kicker. Despite all the headlines and hysteria, critics didn't fall for the hype. At launch, Pokémon Go was infamously bare-bones. No trading, no PvPs in it, no real endgame. Just constant server crashes, glitchy GPS tracking, and the same Pidgey spawns over and over again. It was a technical mess, and critics didn't hold back. Many reviews described it as a brilliant idea crippled by missing features and uneven accessibility. If you didn't live in a major city, the game was almost unplayable. And while its potential was massive, its launch state was anything but. That's why, despite changing gaming history, Pokémon Go debuted with a shockingly low 69 on Metacritic. Legacy aside, on paper, it's one of the worst-reviewed Pokémon games of all time. Still sitting at 69, next up is Pokémon Super Mystery Dungeon, a game that promised to fix everything the previous entries got wrong and somehow managed to create a whole new set of problems. To its credit, Super Mystery Dungeon had scope. 720 Pokémon, a massive world, a darker, more emotional story. This wasn't some lazy cash-in. It was trying to be the ultimate mystery dungeon experience. But critics weren't convinced. The game was painfully slow to start, saddled with hand-holding tutorials that dragged on for hours. Dungeons were repetitive, difficulty spikes were erratic, and while the story had heart, it often felt buried under layers of grind and mechanical clutter. For longtime fans of the series, it had flashes of greatness, but for newcomers, it was more overwhelming than welcoming. It aimed high, but stumbled hard. And in the end, Super Mystery Dungeon joined its predecessors in the bottom ranks of Metacritic's Pokémon scores. Ambition is admirable. Execution is everything. From overwhelming ambition back to an idea that just wouldn't die. Next up is Pokémon Ranger, Shadows of Almia. The second entry in the Ranger trilogy, and the game that was supposed to fix everything the first one did wrong. And to be fair, it tried. Shadows of Almia added more partner Pokémon, a larger world, better mission structure, and actual quality-of-life tweaks. But none of that could save it from the same core issue that dragged the original down. The circle drawing mechanic was still front and center, and still just as frustrating. Critics noted the improvements, but not without caveats. The pacing was slow. The gameplay loop felt outdated even in 2008. And most damningly, the novelty had completely worn off by this point. What once felt unique now felt like a chore. It wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't exciting either. And on Metacritic, that's just as dangerous. With a score of 68, Shadows of Almia proved that sometimes polishing a flawed formula only highlights its weaknesses. The Ranger series wasn't dead yet, but the cracks were clearly showing. And just like that, the trilogy limps to a close. Following Shadows of Almia, the third and final Ranger game, Pokémon Ranger Guardian Signs, tried to inject new life into the series. This time, they added legendary Pokémon, co-op multiplayer, and Guardian Signs you could draw to summon powerful allies. It was supposed to be the big finish, a dramatic send-off. Instead, it felt like the same old loop with a fresh coat of paint. The circle drawing was still here, still central, still exhausting. And while some critics appreciated the slight improvements and new gimmicks, most agreed. The Ranger formula had officially run its course. The story was forgettable, the pacing uneven, and the multiplayer, while a fun idea, was barely a blip on the game's lifespan. It didn't push boundaries, it didn't evolve. It just existed. With another Metacritic score of 68, Guardian Signs marked a quiet, unceremonious end to the Ranger saga. Not with a bang, not with a crash, just a collective shrug. And now that we've closed the book on that trilogy, it's time to move on to the games that didn't just stumble, they flat out fell. From a trilogy that fizzled to a spin-off that started with a stumble. Next up is the very first Mystery Dungeon title in the West. Pokémon. Mystery Dungeon, Red Rescue Team for the Game Boy Advance. The game that kicked off a cult favorite sub-series, introduced emotional storytelling to the Pokémon franchise, and gave fans a taste of what it meant to be the Pokémon. But critics, they didn't bite. Red Rescue Team was praised for its ambition and heartfelt narrative, but nearly every review zeroed in on the same fatal flaws: repetitive dungeon design, grueling grinding, and unpolished mechanics that turned a promising idea into a tedious slog. The AI was erratic, the menus were clunky, and the difficulty curve could veer from sleep-inducing to soul-crushing. And let's not forget, this was released alongside its near-identical DS sibling, Blue Rescue Team. So for critics, it felt less like a groundbreaking RPG, and more like a duplicated experiment with uneven results. Despite its cult status today, Red Rescue Team launched with a Metacritic score of just 67, making it one of the lowest-rated entries in the Pokémon franchise. A game with heart, but not enough polish. From humble beginnings to a sequel nobody really asked for. Coming in next is Detective Pikachu Returns, the 2023 follow-up to one of the weirdest spin-offs in the franchise. After the original game got a Hollywood glow-up with Ryan Reynolds, expectations were sky-high for this long-awaited sequel. What we got instead was a slow, clunky, and shockingly outdated adventure game that felt like it had been sitting on a shelf since 2016. Critics slammed its underwhelming visuals, stiff animations, and laughably simple puzzles that barely challenged even the youngest players. The story, which should have been a slam dunk given the first game's twist ending, felt meandering and low stakes. And while Detective Pikachu's gruff voice and coffee obsession still had charm, even that couldn't carry the game. It wasn't just that the game was bad, it was that it felt completely out of place on the Switch, like a relic from the 3DS era accidentally released in HD. With a Metacritic score of 66, Detective Pikachu Returns wasn't just a disappointment. It was a reminder that lightning doesn't always strike twice, especially when you leave the spark sitting too long. From sequels that felt outdated to DLC that felt unfinished. Next on the list is The Teal Mask, the first expansion for Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, and a painful reminder that sometimes DLC doesn't fix the base game's problems, it just adds more. Critics expected this DLC to address Scarlet and Violet's glaring performance issues and expand the open world in exciting ways. Instead, The Teal Mask delivered a painfully short campaign, minimal new content, and the exact same technical issues that plagued the main game: pop-in, frame drops, awkward animations, and bugs that made the experience feel more like a beta test than a premium expansion. The new region, Kitakami, had potential, but felt lifeless and empty, and the story barely scratched the surface of the rich folklore it hinted at. Even the new Pokémon felt like a missed opportunity, with many players questioning if the $35 expansion pass was worth it at all. With a Metacritic score of just 65, The Teal Mask wasn't just a disappointment. It was a loud signal that players are getting tired of paying full price for half-finished content. And sadly, it wouldn't be the last time this generation would end up on this list. From broken expansions to one of the most divisive 3D console Pokémon games ever made. At number 21 is Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness, the GameCube sequel to Pokémon Colosseum. A game fans look back on fondly for its darker tone, memorable soundtrack, and gritty aesthetic, but that critics? Absolutely shrugged off. With a Metacritic score of 64, Gale of Darkness is one of the lowest-rated mainline-adjacent Pokémon titles ever released. The complaints were consistent. Critics said it played it too safe, reusing Colosseum's engine with only modest improvements. The visuals, while functional, were considered lackluster even by 2005 standards. And the heavy focus on shadow Pokémon, again, felt like a gimmick being stretched too thin. But perhaps the most polarizing element was the structure. With no traditional catching system and a battle system that barely evolved, critics felt it lacked the spirit of a true Pokémon adventure. Fans, on the other hand, still defend it to this day for its mature storyline and unique vibe. But on Metacritic, that nostalgia didn't matter. Pokémon XD remains a cult classic, just not a critical one. From console cult classics to mobile fluff disguised as cozy charm. Also sitting at 64 on Metacritic, we have Pokémon Cafe Remix, a rebranded, reworked version of Pokémon Cafe Mix that tried to breathe new life into a puzzle game most players had already forgotten. On the surface, it's adorable. The art style is polished, the cafe concept is wholesome, and the Pokémon have never looked more huggable. But underneath the cute visuals lies a freemium trap, complete with energy systems, gacha-style recruitment, and difficulty spikes clearly tuned for microtransaction frustration. Critics were torn. Some praised the charm and presentation, while others saw it for what it really was: a shallow, repetitive time-waster dressed up in Pokémon costumes. The gameplay loop is basic: drag icons to make chains, complete simplistic objectives, and grind for currencies. Even after its remix overhaul, critics noted that it didn't fix the core issues. It just shuffled them around. For a series known for depth, exploration, and emotional stories, Cafe Remix felt like empty calories, sweet on the outside, hollow on the inside. And in a ranking of the worst-reviewed Pokémon games, it earns its place, one overpriced macaron at a time. Next up, it's dumb, it's shallow, it's Magikarp. And somehow, it kind of works. At number 19, we've got Magikarp Jump, a mobile spin-off that embraces the franchise's weakest Pokémon and turns it into the star of its own absurd little game. With a Metacritic score of 64, it somehow scored higher than several more ambitious titles, but not by much. The premise is as ridiculous as it sounds. You raise Magikarp, train it to jump as high as possible, enter leagues where the only stat that matters is vertical leap, and then, when it loses, watch it retire or get eaten by a Pidgeotto. Then you do it all over again. There's no depth, no battling, no real Pokémon mechanics. Just Magikarp, jumping, and failing. Critics found it oddly charming for a while, with its quirky art style, tongue-in-cheek humor, and absolutely zero attempt to take itself seriously. But the novelty wore off fast, and the repetitive grind, typical of mobile games, quickly set in. While it's certainly not offensive, Magikarp Jump is the definition of a throwaway spin-off, mildly amusing for an afternoon, then deleted and forgotten. But hey, it knew exactly what it was and, in its own weird way, that earned it just enough points to swim ahead of far worse offenders, from sugary cafes to blocky boredom. Next up is Pokémon Quest, a game that looked like Minecraft and played like a tech demo. Released in 2018 for both Switch and mobile, it was Pokémon's attempt at capturing the casual mobile crowd with tap-heavy combat, auto-battling mechanics, and voxel-style visuals. And while it got millions of downloads at launch thanks to the brand alone, critics weren't fooled. Quest was repetitive, shallow, and painfully limited. The battles essentially played themselves, base management was barebones, and progression quickly hit a paywall disguised as grinding. And while the visual style was cute in theory, in practice it felt more like a novelty than a real design choice, as if depth had been sacrificed for simplicity. The music looped, the gameplay looped, and the fun? That didn't last long. With a Metacritic score of 64, Pokémon Quest showed that not every minimalist experiment needs to be greenlit just because it has Pikachu's face on it. In the end, it wasn't a game. It was a distraction, from blocky boredom to gacha fatigue with a premium coat of paint. At number 17 is Pokémon Masters X, a flashy, character-driven mobile RPG that tried to turn beloved trainers into collectible units and epic battles into microtransaction marathons. When it first launched as Pokémon Masters, the game was riddled with bugs, lacking content, and built around a brutally aggressive gacha system. The EX rebranding tried to patch things up by adding more content, refining systems, and marketing itself harder. But the underlying problems never really changed. Critics weren't impressed. The combat system was shallow, the energy system felt like a leash, and most of all, progression was paywalled, especially when it came to unlocking powerful sync pairs. It looked good, it sounded good, but the experience was built around in-app purchases and grinding, not genuine strategy. Even longtime fans of the series' characters grew tired of seeing their favorites locked behind RNG paywalls. With a Metacritic score of 63, Masters X stands as proof that brand recognition can't mask predatory design. It promised battles worthy of champions. Instead, it felt like a marketing scheme with Pikachu slapped on top. From gacha fatigue to a strategy game that forgot to be fun. Also clocking in at 63 on Metacritic, Pokémon Duel was a strange one. A digital board game, a strategy title, and a battle simulator all mashed into one, with a UI that looked like it was designed by a committee of confused interns. The concept was intriguing. Deploy figure-like Pokémon onto a virtual board, outmaneuver opponents, and clash with dice-based RNG battles. But the execution? Overcomplicated, unpolished, and borderline chaotic. Tutorials were overwhelming. The menus were a mess, and the gameplay felt like it was constantly fighting itself, unsure whether it wanted to be chess, checkers, or Candy Crush. And of course, it couldn't resist the mobile curse. Loot boxes, time gates, and microtransactions galore. Critics and players alike found the mechanics frustrating, the pacing sluggish, and the fun buried under a pile of menus and monetization. It was officially shut down in 2019, and few tears were shed. Pokémon Duel had potential, but in the end, it was just another casualty of the franchise's mobile-era missteps. Strategy without the satisfaction. At number 15 is Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team, the Nintendo DS counterpart to Red Rescue Team. And while they're practically identical in gameplay, critics hit this version even harder, giving it a lower Metacritic score of just 62. For a game launching on more advanced hardware, expectations were naturally higher. But Blue Rescue Team didn't do much to leverage the DS's capabilities. Instead, it delivered the same grindy, repetitive dungeon crawling, the same wonky partner AI, and the same punishing death mechanics, all wrapped in a package that felt dated right out of the gate. Sure, the emotional story and unique premise stood out, but critics couldn't ignore how bare-bones the actual gameplay was. Limited movesets, bland environments, and constant backtracking made the experience feel more like a chore than a quest. Even the added touchscreen features couldn't save it from being labeled as a missed opportunity. So, while fans have since come to appreciate the game for its heart, on paper, Blue Rescue Team remains one of the lowest-rated Pokémon titles ever released, a rocky start for a series that eventually found greatness. Now we've reached the middle of the list, and if you're still watching, thank you. If you're enjoying the video, consider liking and subscribing. It really helps out small content creators like this one and lets me keep digging into the weird, wild world of Pokémon for you. Alright, let's keep descending this cursed ladder of low scores. From humble beginnings to a masterpiece fans loved, but critics absolutely didn't. Coming in at number 14 with a surprisingly low Metacritic score of 60, we have Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time and Darkness. To this day, many fans consider it one of the best Pokémon spin-offs ever made, a pinnacle of emotional storytelling, character development, and world-building. But critics? They weren't having it. While fans were falling in love with Grovyle, time travel twists, and that tear-jerking ending, reviewers were pointing fingers at the game's repetitive gameplay, lack of innovation, and unforgiving dungeon mechanics. Despite an upgraded story and a deeper narrative than its predecessors, the core gameplay loop, Wander Dungeon, Fight Pokémon, Repeat, remained mostly unchanged. And for critics who weren't already bought into the premise, that loop felt like tedium rather than tension. Even improvements like more recruitable Pokémon and expanded storylines couldn't distract from what many called a mechanically outdated system. The result? A game fans still cherish to this day, sitting with a critical score that barely passes. In hindsight, it's one of the clearest examples of the disconnect between emotional resonance and mechanical criticism. Explorers of Time and Darkness meant something, just not to Metacritic. From emotional highs to the spin-off's lowest point. At number 13 is Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity, the 3DS entry that followed Explorers of Sky and crashed headfirst into disappointment. While previous Mystery Dungeon games earned love for their deep stories and surprisingly dark twists, Gates to Infinity stripped that soul away, opting for fewer Pokémon, simplified mechanics, and a painfully slow start that left many players bored before the real plot even began. Critics hammered the game for its limited roster, only around 144 Pokémon out of nearly 650 at the time, its excessive hand-holding, and a dungeon system that somehow felt both repetitive and watered down. The story tried to recapture past emotional beats, but felt hollow in comparison to its predecessors. Even the visuals, while a step up graphically, didn't do enough to save it. The game lacked the spark, the challenge, and the emotional weight that had made Explorers so memorable. And the pacing? Glacial. With a Metacritic score of just 59, Gates to Infinity became the series' worst-rated entry, and many feared it would be the last. It wasn't just a misstep, it was a near-death experience for the entire Mystery Dungeon sub-series. At number 12 is Pokémon Rumble, the very first entry in what would become one of the most divisive spin-off series in the franchise. Released as a downloadable WiiWare title in 2009, Rumble introduced a new style, toy-like Pokémon battling in real-time, chaotic arenas with simplistic controls and even simpler objectives. And while the concept was novel, cute toy Pokémon battling it out in swarms, the gameplay was shallow and repetitive from the jump. Critics blasted it for its bare-bones mechanics, repetitive level design, and a structure that made grinding a requirement rather than an option. It was designed for short bursts of play, but even in those short bursts, the novelty wore thin. Each Pokémon had only 2 moves, and battles quickly devolved into mindless button mashing, with little to no strategic depth. The art style had charm, the soundtrack had energy, but the gameplay? It was pure filler. With a Metacritic score of 59, Pokémon Rumble might have been a fun distraction for a younger audience, but for everyone else it was the beginning of a long-running side series that never quite justified its existence. At number 11 is Pokémon Rumble World, the fourth entry in the Rumble series and the one that decided to go free-to-play. Or, more accurately, free-to-start. Released on the 3DS eShop in 2015, Rumble World tried to spice things up with microtransactions, a world map, and hot air balloon mechanics to unlock stages. But once again, the core gameplay loop remained unchanged. Collect toy Pokémon, spam attacks in basic arenas, and repeat. Critics saw right through it. While the game was technically free, progression was heavily throttled by timers and currency caps, pushing players towards spending real money just to keep playing. Combine that with the same button-mashing combat, the same recycled animations, and the same lack of depth, and you've got what felt like a mobile game shoved onto a handheld console. The new elements, like balloon rides and currencies, only added layers of grind and waiting rather than genuine fun. And even though it eventually received a retail full version, it only confirmed what critics already felt. This was shallow content dressed in gimmicks. With a Metacritic score of 58, Rumble World joins the long list of Pokémon spin-offs that confused quantity for quality. A world of Pokémon, where the adventure feels more like a loading screen, from WiiWare novelty to full-priced regret. Coming in at number 10 is Pokémon Rumble Blast, the 3DS follow-up to the original Rumble and the first to launch as a full retail title. But rather than evolving the formula, it simply stretched it thin, offering more of the same repetitive button-mashing chaos for a much higher price tag. Critics were quick to point out the glaring issues: shallow combat, uninspired level design, and lack of meaningful progression. Sure, there were more Pokémon to collect, and it looked better on the 3DS screen, but the core gameplay was still just hammering the same buttons through nearly identical arenas, over and over and over again. What might have worked as a tender download felt downright offensive at $40. The charm of toy Pokémon had all but worn off, and without any strategic depth or narrative weight, Rumble Blast came off as a lazy cash-in. Even die-hard Pokémon fans struggled to justify its value. With a Metacritic score of just 56, Rumble Blast is a prime example of how giving a shallow idea a bigger budget doesn't necessarily make it deeper. It just makes the disappointment louder. From button-mashing toys to predatory puzzle mechanics. At number 9, we have Pokémon Shuffle, a match 3 puzzle game that blended the classic formula of Bejeweled or Candy Crush with Pokémon catching mechanics, and then aggressively slapped on some of the worst monetization tactics the franchise has ever seen. Originally released on the 3DS and later on mobile, Shuffle looked innocent enough. Match icons, deal damage, catch Pokémon. Simple, right? But underneath the colorful visuals and catchy music lay a brutal energy system, randomized catch rates, and heavily gated progression. You want to keep playing? Wait 30 minutes for a single heart. Want to boost your chances at catching a legendary? That'll cost you coins, and if you're out, real money will do just fine. Critics slammed the game for being less about fun and more about frustration. The puzzles themselves weren't inherently bad. In fact, some were decent. But the constant pressure to either wait or pay completely overshadowed the experience. Even longtime fans found it exploitative. When a Pokémon game leaves you feeling nickel and dimed every step of the way, something's gone very wrong. With a Metacritic score of 56, Pokémon Shuffle didn't just fail to win over critics, it became a symbol of everything people hate about mobile-era game design. Shuffle? More like Shakedown. From battling monsters to babysitting Pikachu through daytime TV. At number 8 is Pokémon Channel, one of the strangest entries ever released under the Pokémon brand, and a game that left both critics and fans wondering, who was this even for? Released on the GameCube in 2003, Pokémon Channel is less of a game and more of a passive experience simulator. You don't catch Pokémon, you don't train, you don't even really play. Instead, you watch Pikachu as he watches various Pokémon-themed TV shows, ranging from quiz games to weather reports to cartoons. Yes, you're watching a character, watch television. Sure, there were some interactive elements like decorating your room, completing a TV schedule, or going on the occasional mini-adventure outside. But most of your time was spent sitting through slow, unskippable cutscenes and waiting for Pikachu to react to something, if he even does. Critics were not kind. The game was called boring, pointless, and even insulting to players' intelligence, especially given it was priced like a full GameCube title. While it might have entertained very young fans for a few hours, it had little to no value for anyone looking for actual gameplay. With a Metacritic score of 55, Pokémon Channel is one of the clearest examples of style over substance, where charm alone wasn't enough to carry a game that felt more like a glorified demo disc than a full-fledged release. Coming next, the fan masterpiece, rated lower than its own failed sequel. This one hurts. At number 7, with a Metacritic score of just 54, we find Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky, a game hailed by fans as the pinnacle of Pokémon storytelling, yet somehow rated lower than its own widely panned sequel, Gates to Infinity, which scored a 59. Let that sink in. The game that nearly killed the sub-series got a higher critical score than the one many fans call a masterpiece. How did we get here? Explorers of Sky was an expanded version of Explorers of Time and Darkness, featuring new content, extra storylines, more playable Pokémon, and a deeper dive into an already emotional narrative. It added everything fans had asked for, and then some. And yet, critics dragged it. Many reviews cited the same complaints as before: repetitive dungeon crawling, sluggish pacing, and dated mechanics. To them, Sky felt like a minor upgrade to an already flawed formula, not worth a full-priced release, and certainly not enough to reevaluate the mystery dungeon gameplay loop. But here's the thing, fans didn't care. They fell in love with the extended epilogues, the tragic backstories, and the richness of the world. The character arcs, like Grovile's sacrifice, Wigglytuff's past, and the final goodbye, left an emotional scar few games ever managed to deliver. Despite its score, Explorers of Sky grew into a cult classic, beloved across generations, with many now calling it the true peak of Pokémon storytelling. So while Metacritic might place it in the bottom 10, history and the fandom tell a different story. Next, barely floating above the bottom with a Metacritic score of 54, we find Pokémon Dream Radar, a glorified AR tech demo that tried to justify its existence with legendary forms, and not much else. Released in 2012 as a companion to Pokémon Black 2 and White 2, Dream Radar used the 3DS's motion controls and augmented reality camera to let players scan their real-world surroundings for dream clouds, zapping them with beams to capture Pokémon. The catch? These weren't really Pokémon you'd use in the game, unless you transferred them into the mainline titles. And that was the entire hook. Play a bare-bones AR minigame long enough, and eventually you could send over some exclusive Pokémon, including the Therian forms of Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus. Critics weren't impressed. Once the novelty of spinning your 3DS around the room wore off, you were left with a repetitive, shallow experience that had almost no substance beyond connectivity. And even that functionality was locked to a very specific pair of games. Dream Radar wasn't offensive, it just didn't justify existing as a standalone product. It felt like something that should have been bundled into a bigger game or included as a free tech showcase, not sold separately. With its Metacritic score of 54, Dream Radar joins the long list of Pokémon experiments that fell flat. Not because they were broken, but because they had nothing meaningful to offer. We've seen missteps, mediocrity, and missed opportunities, but these next 5 go beyond simple disappointment. This is the bottom of the barrel, the worst of the worst. The games that not only failed critically, but often left players wondering how they even got made at all. Whether they're broken, boring, or just baffling, these 5 Pokémon titles represent the darkest depths of the franchise's long history. Let's dive into the bottom 5 Pokémon games on Metacritic. Starting at number 5 is Pokémon Battle Revolution, released for the Nintendo Wii in 2007. On paper, it should have been a dream come true. Full 3D Pokémon battles, online play, flashy visuals, and a spiritual successor to Pokémon Stadium. But in practice, it was a bare-bones, soulless shell of what it could have been. Battle Revolution was the first Pokémon game on a home console to support online multiplayer, which sounds groundbreaking, until you realize there was almost nothing else to do. There was no story mode, no exploration, No mini-games like Stadium's charming distractions. Not even a way to build a proper team in-game unless you owned Diamond or Pearl. Meaning, without a DS and another 35-plus game, this console title was basically unplayable. Critics didn't hold back. The AI was brain-dead, the battle pacing was agonizingly slow, and despite the Wii's capabilities, animations were stiff, recycled, and lacked personality. What should have been the Stadium 3 fans waited for was instead a glorified 3D battle viewer. With a Metacritic score of 53, Battle Revolution wasn't just disappointing, it became a symbol of missed potential. It promised the evolution of Pokémon on home consoles and delivered the exact opposite, a lifeless product banking on brand loyalty. Next, the Amiibo cash grab that forgot to be a game. At number 4, dragging us deeper into the pit with a Metacritic score of just 49, we have Pokémon Rumble U, a game that managed to be both mindless and money-hungry, and somehow still felt unfinished. This was the first Pokémon game to use NFC figures, yes, before Amiibo were even a thing, and it hyped up the feature as if it were revolutionary. You could buy little toy Pokémon, scan them into your Wii U gamepad, and use them in-game. What did that get you? Not much. Rumble U was a shallow, chaotic button masher with barely any content and next to no progression. Battles were repetitive, the camera was a mess, and the difficulty spikes were less about skill and more about whether you'd paid for stronger figurines. Critics saw through it instantly. This wasn't a game built to entertain. It was built to sell. And worst of all, the NFC figures were only sold at select retailers, in blind packaging. So not only was the gameplay thin, it actively encouraged you to gamble on toys just to access content. With its Metacritic score of 49, Rumble U stands as one of the clearest examples of a Pokémon product that prioritized profit over playability. At number 3, with a Metacritic score of 47, we have My Pokémon Ranch, a glorified storage box dressed up as a game, and even that's being generous. Released for WiiWare in 2008, Ranch promised to be a fun way to store and interact with your Pokémon from Diamond and Pearl. What players actually got was an awkward, bare-bones virtual corral, where chibi-fied nightmares of your favorite Pokémon waddled around aimlessly while a me-looking character named Haley dropped in once a day. There was no gameplay to speak of. You couldn't battle, you couldn't train, you couldn't even control your Pokémon, you just watched them. Sometimes they'd make weird noises, sometimes they'd dance. That was it. Critics and fans alike slammed Ranch for its ugly visuals, lack of meaningful interaction, and the fact that it did absolutely nothing better than the PC storage system already built into the games. It was marketed as a Pokémon experience, but it was more like a tech demo no one asked for. Sure, it technically served a function, storage for 1,000 Pokémon, but if you weren't actively transferring creatures from your DS, the whole thing became pointless in about 5 minutes. With its Metacritic score of 47, My Pokémon Ranch proves that Pokémon slapped on a box isn't enough. You need to give people something worth playing. And this? This was digital purgatory. Buckle up, because this next one is a true disaster. The first Pokémon game on the Nintendo DS, and possibly the worst way to introduce the system. At number 2, limping in with a Metacritic score of just 46, we've got Pokémon Dash, a game that somehow took the world's most beloved franchise and turned it into a stylus-destroying nightmare. Released in 2005 as the DS's Pokémon debut, Dash was meant to showcase the touchscreen's potential. Instead, it showcased how not to design a racing game. You played as Pikachu, only Pikachu, and your objective was to frantically swipe the stylus in the direction of checkpoints while racing other Pokémon. Sounds simple? It was. Too simple. The gameplay quickly became a repetitive slog, with players forced to constantly scratch the screen just to maintain speed. The controls were clunky, the camera was disorienting, and the entire experience felt like a tech demo stretched into a full-price title. To make things worse, the courses were barely distinguishable from one another, with bland visuals and level design that relied on gimmicks rather than actual racing mechanics. Even when the game tried to get creative, like having races set on your own Pokémon from the GBA games, it still wasn't fun. It was a gimmick, not a game. Critics tore it apart, with common complaints focusing on the mindless mechanics, lack of variety, and overall sense that Dash was a rushed attempt to ride the DS launch wave. And with its Metacritic score of 46, it earned its place as one of the most forgettable and frustrating entries in the entire Pokémon franchise. We've arrived at the end of this spiral, and at the very bottom sits a game so shallow, so soulless, it has earned the title of the worst Pokémon game ever made. The crown goes to Pokémon Rumble Rush, a mobile disgrace with a Metacritic score of just 42. And make no mistake, this wasn't a case of misunderstood ambition or experimental failure. This was a game that fundamentally lacked effort, polish, and even a reason to exist. Released in 2019 as a free-to-play mobile title, Rumble Rush was supposed to carry on the Rumble series. But what players got was a barely interactive mess. Combat involved mindlessly tapping the screen. There were no real choices, no tactics, no depth, just tap, clear a generic level, collect a Pokémon, repeat. Over and over. Even by mobile standards, it was thin. Critics and players alike slammed it for its repetitive gameplay, bland visuals, and an overall sense that this wasn't a passion project. It was a low-effort cash grab designed to milk microtransactions from the Pokémon name alone. And then, like it never mattered, it was shut down less than a year later. Pokémon Rumble Rush didn't just fail, it sank, dragging the franchise's reputation with it, if only briefly. As the worst-reviewed Pokémon title ever, it stands as a warning of what happens when quality is replaced with complacency. With its 42 Metacritic score and zero lasting impact, Pokémon Rumble Rush proudly wears the crown as the worst Pokémon game ever made. And that wraps up our journey through the 30 worst-rated Pokémon games on Metacritic. Some were bland, some were broken, and one even took the crown as the worst Pokémon game ever made. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss more deep dives into the best and worst of the Pokémon universe. And if you're in the mood for something really chilling, check out this next video, where I rank the 30 most messed up Pokédex entries in the entire franchise. Trust me, you'll never look at some Pokémon the same way again. Click here to watch it now.